Hey dreamers, tonight, a mother will try to make her son immortal, and in failing she will give the world its greatest warrior and its most beautiful tragedy. But what if the most powerful love a mother can feel is also the one that seals her child's fate? What secret ritual did she perform in the dark? One that even the gods feared to attempt? And why did the gods themselves watch this child's birth with such uneasy silence, as if they already knew how his story would end? The story begins not with a hero, but with a wedding, and like all weddings attended by gods, it was destined to end in disaster. Peleus was mortal, which already made him an unlikely groom for a goddess. But Thetis was no ordinary goddess, a daughter of the sea, silver-voiced and storm-eyed, powerful enough to make even Zeus hesitate. He had desired her once, burned for her, until a prophecy whispered that her son would surpass his father in glory. Zeus, who had already overthrown his own father, decided not to risk history repeating itself. So he married her off to a mortal man instead, a decision that would set in motion the birth of a legend, and the curse of a destiny no love could escape. Before you settle in, take a moment to like the video if these journeys bring you a little closer to rest. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from, and what time it is in your corner of the world. Peleus and Thetis consummated their union, and a child quickened in her immortal womb. Thetis felt him growing there, felt the strength of him, the brightness, the terrible potential coiled inside mortal flesh. She knew, as all mothers somehow know, that this child would be extraordinary. But she also knew he would die. Mortality clung to him like his father's blood, an inheritance she could not undo. So she decided to cheat fate. In the dead of night, when Peleus slept and the palace was silent except for the breathing of the sea, Thetis took her newborn son and carried him toward the River Styx. The moon followed her like an omen. This was no ordinary river. It flowed through the underworld itself, black and endless, a current of silence older than the gods. Its waters held the power of unbreakable oaths. The essence of death turned to liquid. Thetis had heard the whispers. A single immersion could make mortal flesh invulnerable. It was forbidden, dangerous. But what is danger to a mother who knows her child will die? She held him by the heel, her divine fingers wrapped around that tiny ankle, and lowered him into the dark. The water hissed like breathing iron. The cold burned. The darkness drank. When she pulled him out, his skin shimmered faintly in the underworld's dim light, changed, hardened, proof against every weapon men could wield. But what Thetis didn't realize was that the river had taken something in return. Every gift from the underworld has its price, and though the gods would never tell her, the Styx had marked Achilles in more ways than one. She looked at her son's perfect skin and believed she had won. Yet fate is patient. It does not fight, it waits, and it only needs the smallest opening. They named him Achilles, he who brings grief to the people, though some say it meant he who has no lips. Language, like prophecy, rarely offers just one truth. Peleus was a good father by the standards of ancient kings. He loved his son fiercely, perhaps knowing in some inarticulate way that their time together would be brief. When Achilles was still a child, old enough to run but young enough to believe the world was fundamentally kind, Peleus sent him to be tutored by Chiron. Chiron lived in a cave on Mount Pelion, but it was no rough shelter. Inside, it opened into chambers of stone and firelight, filled with scrolls and dried herbs, and the quiet music of a lyre played by hands both human and horse. Chiron was a centaur, yes, but not like his wild kin who rampaged drunk through forests and violated boundaries both literal and moral. He was civilized, wise, immortal, and cursed with a wound that would never heal, an arrow dipped in Hydra blood lodged in his flank, burning endlessly. He bore his pain with grace, and perhaps that taught him patience. Under Chiron's guidance, Achilles learned to hunt, to heal, to play music that could gentle storms. He learned the names of herbs and stars, the anatomy of beasts, the history of gods, and the weaknesses of men. Chiron taught him how to wield a spear with precision that bordered on prophecy, how to read the future in an opponent's stance, in the shift of weight, in the moment before violence becomes inevitable. But more than skills, Chiron taught him honor. The old centaur spoke often of kleos, the ancient Greek concept of glory that outlives the body. The idea that fame earned through courage and excellence could make a man immortal in memory, even if his flesh was doomed to rot. Achilles absorbed these lessons like rain into dry earth. They became the core of him, the compass by which he would navigate every choice, every battlefield, every friendship and betrayal that lay ahead. If you could trade a long, peaceful life for a short one filled with glory and remembrance, which would you choose? For me, immortality has always seemed lonelier than it sounds. The years passed in that mountain sanctuary, marked by seasons of snow and wildflowers, by hunts and lessons, and the slow, steady growth of a boy into something more. Chiron watched his student with a mixture of pride and sorrow, for the centaur, who was wise, saw in Achilles a brightness that burned too fiercely to last. When Achilles was 9 years old, a seer named Calchas made a prophecy: Troy would not fall without the presence of Achilles. And furthermore, Achilles himself faced a destiny split into two paths: a long life of peace and obscurity, or a short life crowned with glory that would echo through all of time. The gods, in their infinite cruelty, had given him a choice and made it impossible. Thetis heard the prophecy, and her divine heart broke. She had tried to make her son invulnerable, but she had not thought to make him safe from his own nature. Glory called to Achilles the way the moon calls tides. It was not a matter of choice, but of fundamental truth. She knew he would choose the short path, the bright path, the path that led to early death and immortal fame. So she decided to hide him. When rumors began to spread that the Greeks were gathering forces for war against Troy, when whispers reached her that recruiters would soon come looking for heroes, Thetis took her son. Now on the cusp of adolescence, already beautiful in the way that dooms young men to admiration and violence, and brought him to the island of Scyros. King Lycomedes ruled there, a minor king with daughters aplenty and no sons. Thetis begged him to shelter her boy, and the king, who was not foolish enough to refuse a goddess, agreed. But the hiding required disguise. Achilles was dressed in women's clothing, his long hair braided, his face smooth and still young enough to pass for feminine. He was given the name Pyrrha, which meant red-haired, and placed among Lycomedes' daughters as if he were just another princess learning weaving and songs and the gentle arts of noble women. It should have been humiliating. For a young man raised on Chiron's teachings of honor and martial excellence, this disguise should have chafed like ill-fitting armor. And perhaps it did. But Achilles was also adaptable, gifted with an intelligence that his legends often overlook. He learned the women's quarters, learned to move among them without detection, learned the rhythms of domestic life that most heroes never witness. And he met Didymia, one of Lycomedes' daughters. She had dark eyes and a quiet laugh, and she saw through his disguise almost immediately. Or perhaps he let her see. Either way, a tenderness grew between them, secret and fragile as spring ice. They became lovers in the hidden hours, and she conceived his child. This detail, this small human detail, often gets lost in the grander narrative of his glory. But it matters. Achilles fathered a son named Neoptolemus, who would later fight at Troy himself, carrying his father's violence into the next generation. But that, too, still waited in the future. The disguise held for a time. Months passed in the women's quarters of Scyros, seasons of safety purchased at the cost of truth. Thetis must have hoped it would last longer, that the war would begin and end without her son, that he might slip through fate's fingers and choose the long life after all. But Odysseus was looking for him. Odysseus, the man of twists and turns, the clever king of Ithaca who solved problems the way other men breathed, naturally, constantly, and with great enjoyment of the process. He knew Achilles was essential to the war effort. Calchas had prophesied it clearly enough, and Odysseus had heard whispers that Thetis had hidden her son somewhere, disguised among women. Zeus, of course, never let logic get in the way of divine meddling, but Odysseus never let divine meddling get in the way of a good plan. He arrived at Scyros with gifts, beautiful things, the kind that make young women's eyes brighten. Jewelry and silks, mirrors and perfumes, all the luxuries that speak to vanity and grace. But hidden among them, deliberately, he placed weapons. A spear, a sword, a shield emblazoned with bright bronze. The daughters of Lycomedes gathered around the gifts, exclaiming over the pretty things, reaching for earrings and ribbons. Achilles, dressed as Pyrrha, stood among them. His hands, perhaps, itched toward the weapons. His eyes, perhaps, lingered too long on the spear's balance, the sword's edge. Then Odysseus had his men sound a battle alarm outside the palace, trumpets blaring, shouts of attack, the chaos of sudden violence. The women screamed and scattered, running for safety. Achilles reached for the spear. It was instinct, training, truth, Chiron's lessons rising through years of disguise like bones through shallow soil. He seized the weapon with the practiced grip of a warrior, his stance shifting into readiness, his face transformed by the sudden blaze of purpose. Odysseus smiled. "Found you? Had you ever tried to hide who you truly are, only to have it emerge in a moment of crisis? Sometimes our nature is louder than any disguise." Achilles, unmasked, did not protest. Perhaps relief washed through him, relief at being discovered, at no longer having to pretend. He had been raised for glory, trained for battle, shaped by a centaur who understood that some men are made for war the way birds are made for sky. The disguise had been his mother's desperation, not his choice. He said goodbye to Deiodamia, though the legends rarely linger on that parting. She was pregnant with his child, and he was leaving for a war that would consume years and lives and cities. Did he promise to return? Did he know even then that he wouldn't? The myths don't say. They prefer heroes unencumbered by domestic sorrow. Thetis came to him one final time before he left for Troy. She had failed to keep him hidden, failed to cheat the prophecy that haunted his future, but she could give him one last gift. She travelled to Hephaestus, god of the forge, whose hands shaped miracles from fire and metal. She begged him to craft armor for her son, armor worthy of a hero who would stand against gods and men, armor that would protect him where her river water blessing had succeeded. Hephaestus agreed, perhaps moved by her grief, perhaps simply pleased to create something magnificent. He forged a shield that was a work of art and prophecy, decorated with scenes of peace and war, harvest and stars, the whole cosmos captured in bronze and gold. He made a breastplate that shone like trapped sunlight, greaves that fitted like a second skin, a helmet crested with horsehair that would make Achilles recognizable across any battlefield. The armor was beautiful. It was also doomed, like everything connected to Achilles, to witness glory and be stained with tragedy. Thetis brought the divine armor to her son and helped him don it. Then she looked at him, truly looked, perhaps for the last time, and saw not the child she had tried to save, but the hero he had chosen to become. She told him the truth she had hidden for so long. He had two fates before him. He could stay home, live a long life, marry, have children, grow old in peace and be forgotten. Or he could go to Troy, win glory that would echo through eternity, and die young. Achilles did not hesitate. He chose Troy. Some say this makes him foolish, trading decades of life for a few years of fame. But Achilles understood something that safety seekers often miss, that life is not measured in years, but in intensity, in purpose, in the sharpness of being fully alive. He wanted kleos, glory imperishable. He wanted his name to outlive bronze and stone, to be spoken by people not yet born, to matter. And he succeeded. Here we are, thousands of years later, still telling his story. Achilles sailed for Troy with 50 ships and his closest companion, Patroclus. The myths argue about the exact nature of their relationship. Were they lovers, cousins, brothers in arms, all three? The ancient Greeks themselves seemed uncertain, or perhaps simply unconcerned with modern categorizations. What is clear is this: They loved each other with a ferocity that would define both their lives and deaths, a bond forged in Chiron's caves and tempered by years of absolute trust. Patroclus was older, gentler, less touched by divine heritage and prophetic doom. He had been exiled from his homeland as a boy for accidentally killing another child during a game, and Peleus had taken him in, raised him alongside Achilles. Where Achilles burned bright and sharp, Patroclus was steady, patient, the voice of reason that tempered rage. They completed each other the way fire needs air to burn. The Greek fleet gathered at Aulis, 1,000 ships carrying 10,000 men, all bound for Troy to retrieve Helen, or perhaps for glory, or perhaps simply because war was what heroes did. The fleet was massive, ambitious, doomed to 10 years of suffering that would break most of them. But first they were becalmed. No wind came to fill their sails. The sea lay flat as hammered bronze, and the ships sat motionless, trapped. The seer Calchas explained, Artemis was angry. King Agamemnon, leader of the Greek forces, had killed one of her sacred deer and boasted about it. The goddess of the hunt demanded payment, his daughter, Iphigenia, as a sacrifice. What kind of man sacrifices his child for favorable winds? Agamemnon did, which tells you everything you need to know about his character. He sent for Iphigenia under the pretense of marrying her to Achilles, and when she arrived, he slit her throat on an altar while priests chanted and warriors looked away. Some versions say Artemis saved her at the last moment, replacing her with a deer and whisking the girl away to serve as priestess. Other versions say she died screaming, and the winds rose on the sound of her father's crime. Either way, the fleet sailed, and Troy's doom drew closer. Achilles arrived at Troy's shores like a storm made flesh. His reputation preceded him, son of a goddess trained by Chiron, unbeatable in combat, beautiful as dawn and twice as merciless. The Trojans had reason to fear him even before he stepped off his ship. The war began not with glory but with a landing, bloody and contested. The Trojans met them at the beach, desperate to drive the invaders back into the sea. Men died in the surf, their blood darkening salt water, their cries lost beneath the clash of bronze on bronze. Achilles fought like poetry written in violence. He moved through the Trojan defenders with a grace that seemed choreographed by gods, his spear finding throats and hearts with the precision Chiron had drilled into him. He killed a prince named Cycnus, whose father Poseidon had made invulnerable to weapons, so Achilles strangled him instead, practical and brutal. When your divine blessing doesn't cover suffocation, innovation becomes necessary. The Greeks established their beachhead, dragged their ships ashore, built a camp of tents and walls, and the grim machinery of siege. Troy itself sat inland, behind massive walls that had been built by Poseidon and Apollo themselves in an earlier age. The city was beautiful, wealthy, proud, and it would take 10 years to break. Those years unfolded in raids and skirmishes, ambushes and duels, the slow grinding machinery of ancient warfare. Achilles proved himself the greatest warrior of the age, killing Trojans by the dozen, raiding nearby cities allied to Troy, bringing back plunder and captives and glory. He took a woman named Briseis during one of these raids. She had been a queen, married to the king of Laurenus, and Achilles had killed her husband, her brothers, her entire family. Then he claimed her as his prize, his war bride, his property, in the casual cruelty that defined ancient warfare. But something unexpected happened. Achilles, who had been raised on glory and trained in violence, fell in love with her. Or perhaps love is too simple a word for the complex tangle of respect, tenderness, and need that grew between captor and captive. Briseis was intelligent, dignified despite her loss, and perhaps she saw in Achilles something other than the killing machine he showed the battlefield. Perhaps he saw in her a kind of peace he had not known existed. The Iliad, The great epic that captures the war's final year does not tell us the story of their quieter moments. Homer preferred rage and speeches and bronze-clashing combat. But we can imagine evenings in his tent where she tended his weapons and he learned to ask about her lost family without flinching. Mornings where her presence reminded him that life could contain something other than killing. If you've ever found unexpected gentleness in the midst of chaos, you understand what they might have shared. War makes strange spaces for tenderness. 9 years passed in this grinding siege, 9 years of battles won and lost, of heroes falling, of Troy standing defiant behind its god-built walls. The Greeks grew weary, restless, bitter. They had come for Helen, wife of Menelaus, who had been taken by Paris of Troy in what might have been kidnapping or might have been romance, depending on which side told the story. But Helen seemed a thin excuse for so much suffering, for so many dead, for years stolen from life. In the 10th year, plague struck the Greek camp. Apollo sent it, angry because Agamemnon had insulted one of his priests. Men died in their tents, bodies piling up, the air thick with smoke from funeral pyres. Achilles, who despite his pride understood when gods were involved, called an assembly. He demanded that Agamemnon return Chryseis, the priest's daughter, he had claimed as his own war prize. Agamemnon, who had not improved as a person since sacrificing his daughter for favorable winds, agreed, but only if he could take Chryseis from Achilles as compensation. It was an insult calculated to wound. Agamemnon was the commander-in-chief, older, politically superior, entitled by custom to first choice of plunder. But Achilles was the greatest warrior, the man who won more battles than anyone else, who deserved respect and honor in proportion to his contributions. By taking Briseis, Agamemnon was asserting that rank mattered more than excellence, that political power outweighed martial prowess. Achilles nearly killed him right there. His hand went to his sword, murder bright in his eyes, but Athena appeared, visible only to him, and convinced him to hold back, not out of mercy, but out of wisdom. Killing Agamemnon would split the Greek army, would end the war in Greek defeat, would rob Achilles of the glory he had sailed here to win. So Achilles controlled himself, barely, and let them take Briseis from his tent. He watched her go. This woman who had become more than a prize, more than property, perhaps even more than a lover, she had become his connection to something beyond endless killing. Then Achilles withdrew from the war. He refused to fight. He sat in his tent, rage consuming him like slow fire, while the Greeks suffered defeat after defeat without their greatest champion. He knew they needed him. That knowledge was its own kind of revenge. Let Agamemnon see what war looked like without Achilles on the field. Let the king count the dead and understand the cost of pride. The Trojans, emboldened by Achilles' absence, pushed the Greeks back toward their ships. Hector, Troy's greatest hero, led charge after charge, killing Greeks with righteous fury, defending his city with the kind of courage that makes men tragic. He was everything a hero should be: noble, brave, devoted to family and homeland. He was also fighting on the wrong side of prophecy, which has never cared about virtue. The Greeks begged Achilles to return. They sent ambassadors with magnificent gifts, tripods and gold, horses and women, promises of honor restored. They offered to return Briseis untouched. They offered him everything except genuine apology, except real respect. Achilles refused. His rage had crystallized into something pure and immovable. He would not fight for Agamemnon. He would not save Greeks who followed a king who valued politics over excellence. Patroclus watched his friend's rage with growing concern. He understood Achilles' fury, understood the insult, the wound to honor that cut deeper than bronze could reach. But he also saw Greeks dying by the hundreds, saw ships burning, saw the war slipping toward disaster. Finally, Patroclus made a request. If Achilles would not fight, could he at least let Patroclus wear his armor and enter the battle? The sight of Achilles' distinctive gear might frighten the Trojans into retreat, might buy the Greeks enough time to regroup. Achilles agreed, though unease touched him. He helped Patroclus don the divine armor Hephaestus had forged, the bright bronze that made him look like the goddess-born warrior everyone feared. He gave him one warning: drive the Trojans back, but do not pursue them to the city walls. Show strength, but do not seek glory beyond what is necessary. Patroclus promised. Then he rode into battle wearing his friend's face, his friend's armor, his friend's identity. At first the plan worked brilliantly. The Trojans saw what they thought was Achilles returning to the field, and terror rippled through their ranks. Patroclus fought with borrowed divinity, pushing them back, killing with efficiency that seemed supernatural. He saved the Greek ships from burning, turned the tide of battle, won a victory that should have been enough. But glory is intoxicating, and Patroclus had spent years in Achilles' shadow. Perhaps he wanted to prove himself independently. Perhaps he simply got caught in the momentum of violence. Whatever the reason, he did not stop at the ships. He pursued the fleeing Trojans all the way to Troy's walls, killing prince after prince, pressing advantage into recklessness. Apollo himself intervened, stripping Achilles' armor from Patroclus's body with divine hands, leaving him suddenly vulnerable on the battlefield. A Trojan named Euphorbus wounded him with a spear, and then Hector, seeing his chance, drove his own spear through Patroclus's undefended chest. Patroclus fell, and with him fell everything that had kept Achilles even remotely human. News reached Achilles in his tent. Antilochus, a Greek messenger, brought the words that would change everything. Patroclus is dead. Hector has killed him. Hector has taken your armor from his body. Achilles' grief split the world. He screamed loud enough that his mother heard him beneath the waves. Thetis rose from her ocean depths and came to her son, finding him covered in ashes, tearing at his own hair, consumed by an anguish so absolute it seemed divine in scope. He wanted to die. In that moment, Achilles wanted nothing except to join Patroclus in death, to follow him into the Shadowlands and never return. Thetis held her son while he shattered. This young man who had chosen glory over length of life, who had just discovered that glory meant nothing compared to love. But grief in Achilles did not lead to surrender. It transformed, alchemically, into rage. He swore vengeance. He swore he would kill Hector, would make Troy's prince pay for Patroclus's death with blood and agony. Thetis warned him, if he killed Hector, his own death would follow soon after. The prophecies were clear on this point. Hector's death and Achilles' death were bound together, cause and consequence inevitable as seasons. Achilles did not care. What was life without Patroclus? What was glory without the one person who had known him before he became legendary? Let death come. First, there would be vengeance. But he needed armor. Hector had taken the divine bronze from Patroclus's body, claimed it as spoils. So Thetis returned to Hephaestus and begged him to forge new armor even more magnificent than before. The god of the forge worked through the night, hammering bronze and gold into shapes that captured cosmos and destiny, creating protection worthy of a hero racing toward his death. At dawn, Thetis brought the new armor to her son. Achilles donned it like he was putting on death itself, beautiful, terrible, inevitable. Then he returned to the war. The Greeks had not seen him fight in weeks. They had forgotten what he was capable of, had grown accustomed to war without their greatest weapon. But now Achilles was back, transformed by grief into something beyond human, beyond mercy, beyond anything except the purity of rage. He killed Trojans by the dozen. He killed so many that the river Scamander, which ran past Troy's walls, became clogged with corpses. The river god himself rose up, angry at the pollution, trying to drown Achilles in his own waters. But even a god could not stop him. Hephaestus sent fire to aid Achilles, and the river retreated, scalded and defeated. Nothing could stand before him. He was wrath made flesh, grief weaponized, love turned inside out into killing fury. The Trojans fled before him like leaves before storm wind. Hector stood on Troy's walls and watched Achilles approach. He knew death was coming for him. His parents begged him to come inside the gates, to hide behind Troy's walls, to let others face the goddess-born warrior. But Hector was a hero, and heroes do not hide. He had killed Patroclus. He had taken glory that was not his to claim. Now he would face the price. He waited outside the gates, and when he saw Achilles coming, armor blazing like a second sun, he ran. It was not cowardice, or perhaps it was, and that makes it more human, more true. Hector ran 3 times around Troy's walls, chased by Achilles, the two of them circling the city in a race that everyone knew would end in death. Finally, Athena appeared to Hector, disguised as his brother, promising to help him stand and fight. Thus deceived, Hector stopped running. He faced Achilles. They fought briefly, but the outcome was never in question. Achilles' spear found Hector's throat, piercing the one spot where armor did not quite cover vulnerable flesh. Hector fell, dying, and with his last breath he begged Achilles to return his body to his family for proper burial. Achilles refused. His rage had not diminished with Hector's death. If anything, it had grown hungrier, darker, more terrible. He tied Hector's corpse to his chariot and dragged it around Troy's walls, abrading noble flesh against stones, showing the Trojans what happened to those who killed someone Achilles loved. Every day for 12 days he dragged Hector's body around Patroclus's tomb. The corpse should have decayed, should have been torn apart by such abuse. But Apollo, pitying the dead hero, preserved the flesh from corruption. Even in death, Hector retained some divine protection. The gods grew disturbed. This was excessive even by the standards of Greek heroism, which generally celebrated violence. Zeus himself sent Thetis to convince her son to release Hector's body, and he sent Hermes to guide King Priam, Hector's father, safely through the Greek camp to Achilles' tent. Priam came in the night, an old man entering the tent of his son's murderer, carrying ransom treasure and nothing else except grief and courage. He knelt before Achilles and kissed the hands that had killed his son, kissed them as Achilles had been taught to kiss the hands of his elders in respect. "Remember your own father," Priam said, his voice held steady despite everything. "Peleus is old now, as I am old. He waits for you to return from war. You have that hope." "I have none. My son is dead by your hand. But I have come to beg you, give me his body. Let me bury him with honor. Let me perform the rites that will ease his passage to the underworld." Something in Achilles broke, or perhaps healed. He looked at this old man who had lost so much, and he saw Peleus. He saw his own father, aging without him, waiting for a son who would never return. He saw grief that matched his own, and for the first time since Patroclus's death, he felt something other than rage. He wept with Priam. They cried together in that tent, enemy and enemy, both destroyed by love and loss. Then Achilles agreed. He washed Hector's body himself, prepared it for burial, and released it to Priam with enough time granted for proper funeral rites. It was a moment of grace in a story defined by violence. It was Achilles remembering, briefly, that he was something more than rage. It would be one of his last human moments. The war continued, because wars have momentum that individual moments of mercy cannot stop. Achilles kept fighting, kept killing, kept accumulating the glory he had crossed the sea to win. But the prophecy waited, patient as stones. Paris, Prince of Troy, the man whose actions had started this war by taking Helen, stood on the city walls with his bow. He was not a great warrior like Hector had been. He was a pretty prince, a lover, not a fighter, someone who survived through luck and divine favor rather than skill. But Apollo guided his arrow. The god of prophecy, who had loved Hector and mourned his death, aimed Paris's shot with divine precision. The arrow flew across the battlefield and struck Achilles in the heel, the one spot where Thetis's desperate attempt at immortality had failed to reach, the small, vulnerable point that contained his entire mortality. Achilles fell, the greatest warrior of his generation, brought down by an arrow to the heel, killed by a mediocre prince with a god's help. It should have been absurd. Instead, it was tragedy. He died quickly, perhaps, or perhaps he lingered long enough to understand the irony. His mother had tried so hard to make him invulnerable, and she had succeeded everywhere except the one place that mattered. The gods had promised him glory that would echo through ages, and they had delivered, but they never promised he would live to enjoy it. The Greeks and Trojans fought over his body. Ajax, massive and loyal, defended the corpse while Odysseus drove the Trojans back, and together they carried Achilles back to the Greek camp. Thetis rose from her ocean depths one final time, and her wailing could be heard across the Aegean. They burned Achilles on a funeral pyre that rivaled the sun in brightness, and they mixed his ashes with Patroclus's ashes, so that in death they remained together. They held games in his honor, athletic competitions and contests that celebrated the strength he had embodied. They gave him the glory he had sailed so far to claim. But Achilles was dead at roughly 20 years old, and Troy still stood. The prophecy said Troy could not fall without him, which proved technically true in the most literal way. His presence had been necessary to bring the Greeks this far, to weaken Troy enough that the later trick with the wooden horse would work. But he did not live to see the city burn. His son, Neoptolemus, the child he had conceived with Diomedes during his brief disguise on Scyros, eventually came to Troy. The boy was as brutal as his father, but lacked the grace, the complexity, the grief that had made Achilles almost sympathetic. Neoptolemus helped sack the city, killed King Priam on an altar, threw Hector's infant son from the walls to prevent future revenge. He completed his father's war with none of his father's late blooming mercy. Troy fell, as prophecy had promised, but the cost was so high that the victory tasted like defeat. Most of the Greek heroes died or were cursed. Odysseus spent 10 years trying to reach home. Agamemnon was murdered by his wife on the day he returned. Ajax went mad and killed himself. The war devoured everyone it touched, heroes and civilians alike, leaving only ruins and stories. And Achilles? His spirit went to the underworld, to the grey lands of the dead where all mortals eventually gather. Odysseus, during his own wanderings, visited there and spoke with Achilles' shade. He praised the fallen hero, called him blessed to have won such glory, to have his name celebrated by all who sing of war. Achilles' ghost replied with words that haunted Odysseus. "I would rather be a living slave to a poor man than king of all the dead." Glory, it seems, offers cold comfort when you are young and dead and separated from everyone you loved. Kleos' imperishable fame turns out to be exactly that, imperishable, enduring, eternal. But Achilles himself was gone, and all the songs in the world could not bring him back to feel the sun, to hold Briseis, to laugh with Patroclus over some small victory. His choice had been clear: short life or long life, glory or obscurity. He chose glory, and the bargain was honored exactly as advertised. The world remembers him. We tell his story still, millennia later, proof that his fame did indeed outlive bronze and stone. But the world also remembers his rage, his grief, his brief moment of mercy with Priam, his love for Patroclus that seemed to matter more than any battle. We remember him as human, not just as hero, complex, flawed, beautiful, doomed. His mother, Thetis, lived forever in her ocean depths, immortal and grieving, the goddess who had tried to cheat fate and lost her son to the very glory she had tried to protect him from. Perhaps she understood, eventually, that some mortals burned too bright to be contained, that Achilles was always going to choose the short, bright path, because anything else would have been a betrayal of his nature. The armor Hephaestus forged for him was given to Odysseus after his death, which caused Ajax to go mad with jealousy. Even dead, Achilles' possessions caused conflict. His tomb became a shrine where later heroes would make offerings, seeking courage, seeking glory, seeking something of the fierce purity he had embodied. Some legends say that after death, Achilles was taken to the White Island, a paradise where heroes feast eternally, finally reunited with Patroclus in a realm beyond suffering. It is a pretty story, and perhaps even true in whatever way myths are true. Perhaps somewhere beyond death and time, they hunt together again in forests where no war reaches, where glory is unnecessary because peace is finally enough. But that is speculation, hope, the kind of comfort the living tell themselves about the dead they love. What we know for certain is this: Achilles lived 20 years, won immortal glory, lost everyone he loved, and died on a beach far from home with Apollo's arrow in his heel. Was it worth it? The question is meaningless. Achilles would have chosen the same path 1,000 times. Glory was not a reward for him. It was identity, purpose, the proof that his brief life had weight and meaning. He measured success not in years accumulated, but in intensity achieved, in excellence demonstrated, in making his existence matter enough that we still speak his name. And we do speak it. We tell his story in books and films, in scholarly treatises and casual conversations. We use Achilles' heel to mean a fatal vulnerability, turning his death into metaphor. We invoke his name when discussing heroism, rage, friendship, tragedy, choice. His mother's love could not save him. His divine armor could not protect him completely. But his choice to live fiercely and die young achieved exactly what he wanted: to be remembered, to matter. In the underworld's grey lands, his shade walked among countless dead, all equal in death's democracy, all reduced to whispers and memories. But above, in the world of the living, his story continued growing, evolving, gathering meaning with each retelling. Troy's walls eventually crumbled to dust. The Greek heroes' names faded into myth, but Achilles remained vivid, immediate, as alive in story as he had been in bronze on Troy's beaches. Perhaps that is glory's true nature, not to prevent death, but to give it meaning, not to extend life, but to concentrate it into something pure enough to endure. Achilles chose, and the world is still living with his choice, still telling his story, still arguing about whether he was hero or monster, wise or foolish, victim or volunteer in his own tragedy. The answer, like most truths about humans and gods and the space between them, is probably all of the above. He contained multitudes, rage and love, brutality and mercy, divinity and mortality, glory and grief. He was contradiction made flesh, and he burned bright enough to light up the darkness for thousands of years. His story does not end with moral lessons neatly packaged. It ends with ashes mixed together in an urn, with a mother weeping in ocean depths, with a city burning, with survivors limping home to their own tragedies. It ends with a young man dead before his time, having achieved everything he wanted and lost everything that mattered. But it also never ends. As long as humans tell stories, Achilles will race across that beach, armor blazing, fierce and beautiful and doomed. He will rage at insult, weep for Patroclus, show mercy to Priam, fall to Paris's arrow and rise again in every retelling, forever young, forever racing toward the glory he chose over life itself. The truth is, Achilles' story does not exist in isolation, contained neatly within the span of his 20 years. His absence created ripples that shaped everyone around him, consequences that unfolded long after his ashes cooled. Consider his armor, the magnificent bronze and gold that Hephaestus had forged twice over. After Achilles fell, after his body was recovered and burned, the question arose, who deserved to inherit the arms of the greatest warrior? The Greeks held a contest, a judgment to determine which hero had contributed most to the war effort after Achilles himself. two men claimed the right, Ajax and Odysseus. Ajax was massive, powerful, a warrior of straightforward courage who had held the line countless times through sheer physical dominance. He had carried Achilles' body from the battlefield while Trojans swarmed around him, had defended his friend's corpse with a loyalty that bordered on divine. Odysseus was clever, persuasive, the architect of strategies that saved Greek lives through intelligence rather than brute force. He had convinced Achilles to let Patroclus fight, had orchestrated the recruitment of Achilles in the first place, had contributed victories through cunning. The Greek leaders voted. They chose Odysseus. Ajax felt the decision like a spear through his chest. Not a physical wound, but something worse, the destruction of his sense of honor and justice. He had fought beside Achilles, had proven his worth in blood and sweat and loyalty, and yet the armor went to a man who won through words and tricks. That night, Ajax's mind broke. Madness sent by Athena, who favored Odysseus, made him see the Greek army's livestock as his fellow soldiers. He slaughtered sheep and cattle, thinking he was taking revenge on those who had dishonored him. When dawn came and sanity returned, Ajax found himself covered in animal blood, surrounded by butchered livestock, having made himself ridiculous in the eyes of every Greek who witnessed his madness. The shame was unbearable. He took his own sword, the same weapon Hector had once given him in a moment of chivalric exchange, and fell upon it, dying by suicide rather than living with humiliation. So Achilles' armor, meant to protect, instead caused another hero's death. Even his possessions carried tragedy like a contagion. If you could inherit something powerful from someone you admired, would you want it? Or would the weight of their legacy be too heavy to carry? The armor eventually passed to Neoptolemus, Achilles' son, who came to Troy in the war's final year. The boy had been raised on Scyros by his mother Deiodamia, growing up without knowing his father except through stories and the absence of him. When the Greeks learned from the prophet Calchas that Troy would not fall without both Achilles' son and Achilles' bow, they sent Odysseus to fetch the boy. Neoptolemus arrived at Troy having never seen his father, carrying the weight of a legendary name without understanding what it meant. They gave him Achilles' armor, dressed him in divine bronze, and sent him to fulfill his father's unfinished purpose. He killed without mercy, proving himself his father's son in violence, if not in complexity. When Troy finally fell, brought down not by straightforward battle, but by Odysseus's trick with the wooden horse, Neoptolemus participated in the sack with brutal enthusiasm. He found King Priam, the old man who had once knelt before Achilles and begged for his son's body, the man with whom Achilles had shared tears and understanding. Priam had taken refuge at an altar, seeking protection through sacred space. Neoptolemus dragged him from that altar and killed him there, violating both hospitality and holy ground. He murdered Priam's grandson Astyanax, hurling Hector's infant son from Troy's walls to ensure no male heir survived to seek revenge. These acts lacked Achilles' fierce honor, his capacity for mercy in moments of clarity. Neoptolemus was pure violence without the tempering grief that had made his father almost sympathetic. He inherited the glory but not the humanity. After Troy fell, Neoptolemus claimed Andromache, Hector's widow, as his prize, taking her as Achilles had once taken Briseis. But where Achilles had found unexpected tenderness with his captive, Neoptolemus simply possessed her, married her, used her as proof of his conquest. She bore him sons while mourning the husband and child he had helped destroy, living embodiment of war's cruelty to women who survive. Years later, Neoptolemus traveled to Delphi to consult Apollo's oracle, seeking answers about his future. The god of prophecy, who had guided the arrow that killed Achilles, was not inclined toward mercy for the son. Orestes, who had his own grievances against Neoptolemus over a woman they both claimed, killed him at Delphi, murdered him in Apollo's sanctuary, poetic justice for Priam's death at an altar. Even Achilles' bloodline could not escape tragedy's gravitational pull. But let us return to Achilles himself. to the immediate aftermath of his death, to the moment when the Greeks had to continue their war without their greatest weapon. The fighting intensified after Achilles fell. The Trojans, emboldened by his absence, pressed harder. The Greeks, demoralized by the loss, struggled to maintain hope. Heroes emerged from both sides to fill the vacuum his death created, but none shone with his particular brightness, none carried the same sense of inevitability. Memnon arrived, a king from Ethiopia, son of the dawn goddess Eos. He was beautiful, powerful, possibly Achilles' equal in combat. He killed Antilochus, the young warrior who had brought Achilles news of Patroclus's death and thus earned his own measure of Greek hatred. In another timeline, Memnon might have been the hero of his own epic, the warrior whose glory rivaled the sun. But he had the misfortune of arriving after Achilles had already claimed the narrative, already defined what heroism meant in this particular war. Penthesilea came too, queen of the Amazons, leading her warrior women into battle on Troy's behalf. The Amazons fought with a ferocity that matched any male warrior, proving that excellence in combat knew no gender. Penthesilea killed many Greeks before she fell, though stories disagree about who killed her, some claiming it was Achilles himself in his final battles, others placing her death after his. One version of her story haunts more than others. Achilles struck her down in battle, and as she fell, her helmet came off, revealing her face. He saw her beauty in that moment, saw the warrior's courage in her dying eyes, and fell in love with her even as she died. It was too late for anything except regret, too late for the kind of connection that might have existed between two warriors who understood the cost of choosing glory over length of days. Thersites, a Greek soldier known for his ugliness and his sharp tongue, mocked Achilles for this momentary softness, this flash of feeling for a dead enemy. Achilles killed him with a single blow, which tells you something about the boundaries of acceptable speech in ancient warfare. You could die screaming, but you could not mock a hero's grief without consequences. These stories proliferate around Achilles like flowers around a grave, small narratives attracted to his central myth, trying to capture something of his radiance. The ancient Greeks kept adding to his legend, expanding it, giving him more battles, more loves, more moments of glory and grief. They could not let him go, could not let his story end cleanly. Some versions claimed he was made entirely invulnerable, not just in the heel, but everywhere except that one spot. Others said Thetis had tried to burn away his mortality in fire, not drown it in the Styx, and Peleus had interrupted her, saving the baby but leaving him partly mortal. The details shifted depending on who told the story, but the core remained constant: a mother's desperate attempt to protect her son, a hero's choice of glory over safety, a death that came anyway. In the underworld, his shade supposedly conversed with other dead heroes, creating a kind of afterlife community of the gloriously fallen. Homer's Odyssey gives us that brief glimpse of him expressing regret for choosing death and fame over life and obscurity. But other accounts show him more satisfied, more at peace with his choice, suggesting that perhaps his mood varied depending on which poet was channeling his voice. Some mystics claimed Achilles was not truly dead, that he lived forever on the White Island in the Black Sea, a paradise where the greatest heroes feast eternally. Sailors reported seeing him there, still young, still beautiful, training with other legends in fields that never knew winter. It is the kind of story the living tell themselves about the dead they cannot accept losing, that somewhere, somehow, they continue. The cult of Achilles persisted for centuries after the Trojan War supposedly occurred. Cities claimed connection to him, built temples and shrines, made offerings to his shade. Athletes invoked his name before competitions, soldiers before battles, anyone seeking courage or excellence, or the strength to choose difficulty over ease. Alexander the Great, centuries later, consciously modelled himself on Achilles, claimed descent from him, slept with the Iliad under his pillow, made pilgrimages to his supposed tomb. He understood that Achilles represented something beyond mere military prowess, the willingness to burn bright and brief, to sacrifice everything for glory, to make your life matter even if that mattering costs you your life. Did this make Alexander wise or foolish? He conquered most of the known world before dying at 32, not much older than Achilles had been. He achieved fame that outlasted his empire, but he also died young, far from home, having lost most of the friends who had helped him rise. Perhaps he learned from Achilles both how to win glory and how to pay its price. The Romans adopted Achilles into their own mythology, though they viewed him differently than the Greeks had. To the Romans, who valued duty and discipline over individual glory, Achilles represented dangerous pride, the kind of excellence that destabilizes societies. They preferred Aeneas, the Trojan hero who escaped Troy's fall and founded Rome, who chose duty over passion and collective good over personal glory. But even Rome could not dismiss Achilles entirely. He was too vivid, too perfect an embodiment of heroic ideals, too powerful as metaphor and inspiration. They told his stories while warning against his choices, a perfect example of everything attractive and terrible about unfettered individualism. The medieval period transformed him again, making him a knight in their own image, courtly, romantic, bound by chivalric codes that would have baffled the original Bronze Age warrior. They gave him adventures the Greeks never imagined, sent him on quests for love and honor, softened his rage into something more palatable to Christian sensibilities. The Renaissance rediscovered his Greek origins, stripping away medieval editions and trying to recapture what Homer had written. Scholars argued over interpretations, artists painted him in idealized classical poses, writers reimagined his relationships for contemporary audiences. He became a lens through which each generation examined its own values, its own understanding of heroism, sacrifice, and choice. What makes a hero in your estimation? The willingness to die for a cause, or the wisdom to know which causes are worth dying for? The question of Achilles' relationship with Patroclus has provoked centuries of debate, interpretation, and occasionally awkward avoidance. The ancient Greeks themselves seemed uncertain about how to categorize their bond. Homer's Iliad shows them as deeply devoted companions, sleeping in the same tent, Achilles withdrawing from battle only when his own honor is insulted, but returning in murderous rage when Patroclus dies. The emotional intensity is undeniable, but Homer never explicitly labels their relationship. Later Greek writers were more direct. Plato's Symposium discusses them as lovers, arguing about which one was the Erastes, older lover, and which the Eromenos, younger beloved, getting the age relationship backwards since Patroclus was actually older. Aeschylus wrote plays depicting them as lovers, but other ancient sources treat them as cousins or simply as the deepest of friendships, the kind of bond between warriors that transcends simple categorization. Perhaps the ambiguity is the point. Perhaps their relationship was exactly as deep, as essential, as necessary as the story requires, beyond labels, beyond the limitations of language, simply two people whose souls recognized each other and chose to be everything to each other. Patroclus was the person for whom Achilles broke his rage strike against Agamemnon. He was the person whose death transformed Achilles from angry to annihilating, from sulking to grief-maddened, from hero to force of nature. The quality of love matters more than its category, and Achilles' love for Patroclus, whatever form it took, was absolute enough that losing it broke him in ways that 1,000 battles never had. Modern retellings continue this transformation of the myth. Novels explore Achilles from Patroclus's perspective, from Briseis's viewpoint, from Thetis's grief-stricken understanding. Films give us Achilles as action hero, as tragic romantic, as symbol of toxic masculinity or exemplar of male vulnerability. Each interpretation tells us as much about our own era's preoccupations as it does about the Bronze Age story beneath all these layers. The archaeological reality of Troy adds another dimension to the legend. We know now that Troy existed, that it was destroyed multiple times, that wars happened there, even if the specific war Homer described might be mythologized amalgamation of multiple conflicts. The discovery of Troy's ruins in the late 19th century gave Achilles' story a geographic anchor, a physical place where imagination could touch something real. But whether Achilles himself existed remains unknown and perhaps unknowable. He might have been a real warrior whose deeds grew legendary. He might have been entirely invented, a fictional embodiment of Greek martial ideals. He might have been something in between, a minor figure whose story attracted elements from many different sources until it became the version Homer crystallized in verse. Does it matter if he was real? His impact on human culture has been genuine regardless of his historical existence. He has inspired actual people to actual courage, caused actual debates about ethics and choice, given actual language to grief and rage, and the complex relationship between love and violence. We say Achilles heel when we mean a vulnerability that can destroy something otherwise strong, applying his death metaphorically to businesses, political movements, personal weaknesses. We reference his rage to describe anger that feels justified, purifying, powerful enough to reshape circumstances. We invoke his choice when discussing work-life balance, risk assessment, the value of legacy versus longevity. He has become shorthand for a type of person, a type of choice, a type of tragedy. In that sense, he is as real as any historical figure. Perhaps more real, because his story has been refined and perfected through centuries of retelling, stripped of the mundane complications that make actual people contradictory and difficult to summarize. The Greek concept of kleos, glory, imperishable, has aged interestingly. In Achilles' time, or at least in the time his story claims to represent, kleos meant your name and deeds sung by poets, remembered by tribes, spoken around fires. It meant mattering enough that your community kept your memory alive, but it was inherently unstable, dependent on continuous retelling, vulnerable to the death of cultures and languages. Achilles has achieved kleos beyond anything he could have imagined. His story has survived the death of ancient Greek civilization, the fall of Rome, the transformation of medieval Europe, the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, modernity, post-modernity. He has been translated into hundreds of languages, adapted into countless media, analyzed by scholars in disciplines that did not exist when Homer was composing. If the afterlife exists, and he maintains any awareness of the living world, does he consider this success? Has glory imperishable proven satisfying, or does his shade still whisper that he would rather be a living slave than king of the dead? Perhaps both answers are true simultaneously. Perhaps glory matters immensely and not at all. Perhaps the choice Achilles made was the right choice for him and also a tragedy. Human experience accommodates contradictions that logic rejects. His mother, Thetis, deserves more consideration than she often receives. She was a goddess forced into marriage with a mortal, a being of immense power restricted by Zeus's paranoia about prophecy. She loved her son with the fierce, protective intensity of someone who knows exactly what is coming and cannot prevent it. Every moment of Achilles' childhood, she knew he was doomed, knew she would outlive him by eternity, knew that loving him meant eventually losing him. She tried everything, the immersion in the Styx, the divine armor, the hiding on Syros. She intervened with gods, begged favors, used every resource available to her, and still Achilles chose the path toward Troy, toward glory, toward death. What must that have felt like? To be a goddess, to have power enough to make rivers burn and storms obey, and still to be helpless before your child's choice? To watch him sail away knowing you will receive his ashes, that you will weep in ocean depths while his name is sung by humans whose lifespans barely register as time passing to your immortal perception? Thetis represents a kind of grief that mortals, mercifully, cannot fully experience. eternal mourning, loss without the comfort of eventual death to end awareness of absence. She had to continue existing, forever, in a world that contained her son only in memory and story. Some versions claim she still visits his tomb, still brings offerings, still grieves after millennia. Others say she withdrew from human affairs entirely, sinking into ocean depths so profound that even other gods could not find her. Both options sound like torture. If you knew your choice would cause someone who loves you endless grief, would that change your decision, or would you still follow your own path? The supporting characters in Achilles' story deserve their own recognition, their own acknowledgement as people, rather than merely props for his drama. Briseis was a queen who watched Achilles kill her family, who became his captive and somehow found connection with him, who was used as a token in a power struggle between proud men who survived the war and presumably lived on with memories of everything she lost. Deiodamia bore Achilles' son and watched him leave for a war he would not survive, raising Neoptolemus alone, eventually seeing her son follow his father into violence and tragedy. Andromache lost her husband Hector to Achilles' rage, her son to Neoptolemus's cruelty, her autonomy to Greek conquest, and had to continue living through all of it. These women's stories intersect with Achilles' legend, are shaped by his choices, but extend beyond him into their own griefs and survivals. The tradition of focusing on male heroes often renders women invisible except as prizes or motivation, but they were people with their own complex experiences of the war that destroyed their world. The same is true for the countless unnamed soldiers who died on Troy's beaches, for the Trojans who defended their city knowing they were doomed by prophecy, for the Greeks who fought for 10 years far from home for a war whose purpose grew increasingly unclear. Each was someone's son, many were fathers, all had lives that mattered to someone. Achilles killed hundreds of them personally. His Aristeia, his moments of superhuman combat prowess, involved slaughtering men like harvesting grain. The Iliad sometimes names them, gives brief glimpses of their humanity before Achilles' spear takes their life. Homer understood that glory requires victims, that the bright center of heroic narrative casts shadows populated by the unheroic dead. This does not make Achilles a villain. He was doing what his culture trained him for, what the Greeks expected from their greatest warrior, what he believed would earn him the immortal glory worth dying young to achieve. But it does make him complicated. A hero from certain angles, a catastrophe from others, like most humans magnified to mythological scale. The Trojan War itself has become shorthand for conflicts that destroy everyone involved, for wars that begin with clear causes and devolve into self-perpetuating violence, for situations where victory costs so much that it becomes indistinguishable from defeat. Nearly all the Greek heroes died or were cursed. Troy was utterly destroyed. Helen, whose face supposedly launched 1,000 ships, watched civilizations burn over her and then went home to resume life with Menelaus, which must have been its own complicated trauma. What did it accomplish? The Greeks got Helen back, but most of them died in the process or shortly after. Troy fell, but it had already been destroyed multiple times before and would be rebuilt again. Glory was won, but at the cost of so much suffering that even the gods eventually grew disturbed. And yet the story persists, retold endlessly, because it captures something true about human nature. Our capacity for excellence and destruction, our willingness to sacrifice for abstractions like honor and glory, our ability to love and kill with equal intensity. Achilles stands at the center of this as the purest distillation of the war's essential contradictions. He was the best warrior, therefore most responsible for Greek success. He was also the most temperamental, willing to let Greeks die rather than swallow his wounded pride. He was capable of rage that drowned cities and mercy that moved enemies to tears. He loved deeply enough to choose death over dishonor to that love, but his loving itself involved violence against the beloved's people and family. He contains multitudes, contradictions, complications that make him endlessly fascinating to examine. We can admire his commitment while questioning his values. We can mourn his death while acknowledging his killings. We can understand his choice while choosing differently ourselves. What aspects of Achilles do you find most compelling? His loyalty, his rage, his choice, or something else entirely? The weapons of Achilles have their own mythology layered onto his primary story. The spear he carried was called Pelion Ash, cut from Mount Pelion where Chiron lived, given to Peleus at his wedding, impossibly heavy so that only Achilles could wield it properly. Patroclus, when he wore Achilles' armor, left the spear behind because he could not manage its weight, a detail that proved significant, marking him as not actually Achilles to anyone paying attention. The shield Hephaestus forged received the most detailed description in all of Homer, over 150 lines of poetry describing the scenes hammered into its surface. It showed cities at peace and war, harvests and vineyards, dancing and court judgments, the ocean surrounding everything. It was a cosmos captured in bronze, a reminder that even warriors live in a world larger than battle, that glory is achieved in context of ordinary life continuing elsewhere. But that shield could not save him. The armor could not save him. His mother's desperate attempt to make him invulnerable could not save him. Nothing could save him from the choice he had made, from the path he had chosen, from the prophecy that had always been waiting. In the end, he died as prophesied, young, glorious, remembered. And we are still here, thousands of years later, still telling his story, proving that at least in that one regard, he won completely. His kleos has indeed proven imperishable. But what of the life he sacrificed to achieve it? The years he might have had with Briseis, the son he barely knew existed, the peace he might have found if he had chosen obscurity? The decades he could have lived, growing into middle age, old age, becoming someone other than eternally young warrior frozen in legend? We cannot know if that alternative life would have satisfied him. Perhaps he would have grown restless, bitter, haunted by roads not taken. Perhaps he needed to burn bright and brief because anything else would have felt like slow death anyway. Some natures require intensity over duration, meaning over length, impact over comfort. Or perhaps he would have been happy. Perhaps he could have found purpose in smaller glories, in living well rather than dying memorably, in love and children and the ordinary satisfactions that most people build lives from. Perhaps the choice between long, obscure life and short, glorious death was a false dichotomy created by prophecy, and he could have achieved both longevity and meaning if he had been willing to redefine what meaning looked like. We will never know, which is perhaps part of why his story haunts. It is a choice permanently made, forever beyond revision, crystallized in the moment of decision and consequences. We get to wonder endlessly about the roads not taken, the lives not lived, the other versions of Achilles that might have existed in parallel possibility. The archaeology of grief is visible in how his story has been preserved and transformed. Each generation projects its own concerns onto him, finds its own meanings in his choices. The warrior culture that created him saw glory worth dying for. Later philosophies questioned that valuation. Still later interpretations focus on his relationships, his emotions, his humanity rather than his combat prowess. He has been used to justify warfare and to critique it, to celebrate masculine strength and to examine toxic masculinity, to explore queer relationships and to enforce heteronormative readings. He has been everything to everyone precisely because his story is old enough and rich enough to support multiple interpretations. This is what immortality through story actually means. Not that everyone agrees about you, but that everyone has opinions. Not that your meaning is fixed, but that each generation rediscovers you differently. Not that you remain unchanged, but that your story is elastic enough to survive transformation. Achilles, as Homer wrote him, is not quite Achilles, as Aeschylus dramatized him, who is not quite Achilles as Virgil portrayed him from the Trojan perspective, who is not quite Achilles as medieval romances imagine him, who is not quite Achilles as we imagine him now. And yet somehow all these versions are Achilles, recognizable across centuries and cultures, the same essential story told in endlessly varied ways. His heel has become perhaps his most famous feature, the vulnerability that defined his doom, more culturally significant than his strength, more memorable than his victories. The phrase Achilles' heel has traveled through centuries into modern boardrooms and therapy sessions, into military strategy and personal development books. It describes the fatal flaw hidden within apparent perfection, the single vulnerability that renders all other strengths meaningless when properly exploited. This metaphorical life of his death wound demonstrates how myths function in culture. They provide language for experiences that feel universal, patterns we recognize in our own lives even when separated by millennia from the original context. We all have our Achilles heels, those small weaknesses that could undo us despite our strengths elsewhere. The myth gives us vocabulary for that reality. But reducing Achilles to his heel, to his one vulnerability, misses the richness of what his story actually offers. His heel matters because of what it represented, his mother's love expressed through desperate magic, the gap in protection that allowed fate to fulfill itself, the reminder that invulnerability is always incomplete, that perfection is always compromised. The gods themselves, watching from Olympus, had complex relationships with Achilles. They intervened in his life constantly, shaping his destiny, yet they could not save him any more than Thetis could. Zeus honored him but would not prevent his death. Athena guided and protected him in battle but let Apollo guide the arrow that killed him. Hephaestus forged him armor that made him look invincible but could not actually make him so. Divine attention, it turns out, is not the same as divine salvation. The gods loved spectacle, loved heroes, loved excellence demonstrated through suffering. They gave Achilles gifts that enhanced his glory but could not extend his life. Perhaps they understood that his glory required his early death, that the brightest flames burn briefest, that immortality through fame requires mortality through flesh. Apollo especially played a complex role in Achilles' story. The god of prophecy, music, healing, and archery, all disciplines that Chiron had taught Achilles, became instrumental in his death. Apollo had loved Hector, mourned him, preserved his corpse from desecration. When the chance came to avenge Troy's greatest defender, Apollo took it, guiding Paris's arrow with divine precision to the one spot where Achilles could be killed. There is poetry in that. Achilles, killed by the god whose domains most closely matched his education, struck down by divine archery after a lifetime of mastering weapons, destroyed through the gap in protection his mother's love had accidentally created. Fate works through irony as much as through inevitability. The other heroes of the Trojan War live in Achilles' shadow, even in their own right. Odysseus got his own epic, the Odyssey, but it is explicitly positioned as sequel to Achilles' story, what happened after the greatest warrior died. Ajax, Diomedes, Agamemnon, Menelaus, all were formidable, all achieved glory, all suffered tragedies, but none burned quite so bright, quite so memorably. Hector alone approaches Achilles in how he is remembered, but Hector's glory comes partly from his role as Achilles' greatest victim, the noble defender who stood against unstoppable rage and died as heroes must. His goodness highlights Achilles' complexity, his courage emphasizes Achilles' superiority, his death serves Achilles' narrative even as it creates its own tragedy. This is perhaps unfair to Hector, who deserves to be remembered for his own sake, not merely as Achilles' antagonist. But that is how narratives work. Central figures create gravitational pulls that bend everything nearby into relationship with them. Achilles is the sun around which other characters orbit, and his brightness makes it difficult to see them clearly in their own light. What would Troy's story be without Achilles? Still tragic, still epic, but fundamentally different. The city might have held longer without his presence among the Greeks. Different heroes might have emerged as central. The shape of the narrative would have been altered in ways both subtle and profound. But Achilles was there, did fight, did kill Hector and countless others, did die young, having achieved exactly what he intended. And his presence transformed not just the war but the entire concept of what heroism means in Western culture. The Romans, when they created their own foundation myth, made sure to connect it to Troy. Aeneas, fleeing the burning city, eventually founded Rome, making Roman civilization the descendant of Troy, not Greece. This allowed Romans to claim descent from heroes while positioning themselves as inheritors of the losing side, the noble defenders rather than the aggressive invaders. In Roman retellings, Achilles becomes more problematic. Excessive in his rage, dangerous in his pride, ultimately less admirable than dutiful Aeneas who sacrificed personal desire for collective destiny. The value system shifted, and Achilles' reputation shifted with them. Glory for its own sake seemed less valuable than service to empire. Medieval Christianity struggled with Achilles. His pagan excellence, his choosing of fame over life, his pride and wrath, all conflicted with Christian virtues of humility, eternal life, and subordination of self to divine will. Yet he was too magnificent to dismiss, too deeply embedded in classical education to ignore. So they transformed him. Medieval romances gave him Christian-compatible motivations, courtly love affairs, quests that resembled spiritual journeys. They made him safer, more palatable, less pagan. They kept the name and the basic shape of the legend while hollowing out the values that had defined him originally. The Renaissance tried to recover the Greek Achilles, stripping away medieval editions, returning to Homer as source, but they could not fully escape their own era's concerns any more than the medievals could. Renaissance Achilles became a study in humanism, in the tension between individual excellence and social responsibility, in the classical ideal of the complete person, warrior, poet, philosopher. Each transformation tells us about the era doing the transforming. We see ourselves in the myths we choose to preserve and how we choose to preserve them. Achilles has survived every cultural shift for over 2 millennia because he is elastic enough to contain our projections, complex enough to support multiple interpretations, vivid enough to remain compelling despite distance. Modern retellings continue this tradition. Contemporary novels explore his psychology, give voice to characters Homer marginalized, question assumptions about heroism and glory that ancient Greeks took for granted. Films make an action hero or tragic romantic depending on the director's vision and the audience's expectations. Academic analyses examine him through lenses of gender studies, post-colonial theory, disability studies, queer theory, finding new meanings in ancient text. If you could reshape a classical myth to reflect your own values, which one would you choose, and how would you change it? The question of whether Achilles was happy haunts his legend. He achieved everything he set out to achieve, became the greatest warrior, won imperishable glory, made his name immortal. By the metrics he valued, he succeeded completely. Yet his ghost in the underworld expresses regret, claims he would prefer humble life to glorious death. Was the regret genuine, or merely a moment of weakness, the shades equivalent of depression in the grey lands of the dead? Did Achilles understand something in death that he could not grasp in life? That glory rings hollow when you cannot enjoy it? That fame means nothing to the person actually dead? Or was Homer using Achilles' ghost to comment on glory's ultimate emptiness, to question the very values that drove the Trojan War and countless other conflicts? The Odyssey, after all, is partly about Odysseus learning that home and family matter more than adventure and fame, that the goal is to survive and return, not to die gloriously abroad. Perhaps both truths coexist. Achilles made the right choice for who he was, given his values and understanding, and that choice led to predictable misery once he experienced its consequences. Perhaps there was no correct answer, only the choice each person makes based on incomplete information about what will actually satisfy them. The teaching of Chiron echoes through Achilles' story in ways both obvious and subtle. The centaur taught him to fight, yes, but also to heal, to make music, to understand the natural world. These gentler skills rarely appear in accounts of Achilles' battles, but they shaped him nonetheless. They made him capable of mercy with Priam, capable of love with Briseis and Patroclus, capable of being something more than a killing machine. What if Chiron had taught him differently? What if the emphasis had been on healing rather than hunting, on music rather than martial arts? Would Achilles have chosen the peaceful long life instead? Or would his nature, his divine heritage, his mother's protective anxiety, all have pushed him toward glory regardless of education? We cannot know, and that uncertainty is part of the story's power. Achilles feels simultaneously fated and choosing, destined and free, shaped by circumstances beyond his control while still bearing responsibility for his decisions. This ambiguity mirrors how humans experience our own lives, never quite sure how much is chosen versus determined, free will versus fate, nature versus nurture. The Trojan women who survived the war, Hecuba, Andromache, Cassandra, others, watched their world burn because of men's choices about honor and glory. They lost husbands, children, freedom, homeland, everything that had defined their lives, and they had to continue living, enslaved to the victors, carrying memories of everything destroyed. Achilles was personally responsible for much of their suffering. He killed their defenders, sacked their cities, took them as prizes. From their perspective, he was not a hero but a catastrophe, not glorious but monstrous, not admirable but traumatic. This does not appear in most retellings. Heroes' stories usually focus on heroes' perspectives, honor their values, justify their violence through narrative structure. The victims become background, motivation, property, rarely full people with their own valid perspectives on events. But they were people. They had lives before the war, hopes and fears and loves and losses. Achilles' glory was built on their suffering, and acknowledging that complicates his legend in necessary ways. He can be both a great warrior and a source of trauma, both a hero in his own story and a villain in others, both admirable and terrible depending on where you stand. This complexity is what keeps his story vital. Simple heroes bore us eventually, become predictable, lose the power to challenge or surprise. But Achilles remains unsettling, uncomfortable, impossible to dismiss or fully embrace. He forces us to think about what we value and why, about the costs of greatness, about whether glory justifies suffering. The Iliad ends not with Achilles' death, but with Hector's funeral, the Trojans mourning their greatest defender while the war continues, Achilles still alive, Troy still standing though its doom is certain. Homer chose to freeze the story before its conclusion, to leave Achilles alive in the poem, even though every reader knew he would die shortly after. This creates strange tension. We read about Achilles in the Iliad knowing his death is imminent, knowing his victories are temporary, knowing everything he achieves will lead to his own destruction. The dramatic irony is thick. We know more than the characters, see the ending approaching while they live in their present moment. But that is how all lives work, is it not? We move through our days not knowing when death will come, acting as if we have infinite time while actually having unknown but finite amounts. Achilles' story, with its clear prophecy, just makes explicit what is implicit in every human life. We are all living in the shadow of death, all making choices without knowing their full consequences, all trying to create meaning despite mortality. His mother knew this from the beginning, and it broke her. She could see both possible futures, long, peaceful life or short, glorious one, and she could see which her son would choose. She tried to prevent it, to give him invulnerability, to hide him from his destiny. But she could not save him from himself, from his own nature, from the choice he would inevitably make. There is something profound in a goddess's powerlessness before her mortal son's free will. Divine power could reshape rivers and forge miraculous armor, but it could not override one young man's decision about how he wanted to live and die. In that moment, mortality proved stronger than divinity, not because death is more powerful than gods, but because choice is. Would you rather live knowing your fate, as Achilles did, or die surprised without warning like most people do? The ancient Greeks staged theatrical performances of Achilles' story tragedies that explored his rage, his grief, his choices. Audiences who knew the myths by heart watched actors portray familiar scenes, finding new meaning in old stories through the lens of dramatic performance. They wept for Achilles, even though they knew how his story ended, even though they had heard it countless times before. This suggests that myth's power comes not from surprise, but from resonance, not from novelty, but from truth. We return to the same stories repeatedly because they articulate something essential about human experience, because they help us understand ourselves and our choices, because they give shape to emotions that otherwise remain chaotic and overwhelming. Achilles articulates rage better than perhaps any other character in literature. His anger is not petty or irrational. It emerges from genuine insult, from violation of honor, from disrespect of his contributions and worth. But it also escalates beyond proportion, consumes him, blinds him to consequences, causes suffering that extends far beyond the original injury. We recognize that pattern. Who has not felt righteous anger that began justified but grew toxic? Who has not nursed grievances that hardened into something destructive? Who has not let pride prevent reconciliation that wisdom would have pursued? Achilles' rage is mythological in scale, but human in essence. His grief, too, resonates across time. The devastation he experiences when Patroclus dies, the complete shattering of self, the wish for death, the rage that emerges from unbearable loss, these are universal experiences of profound bereavement. The particulars differ, but the emotional landscape is instantly recognizable to anyone who has lost someone central to their existence. Literature and art across centuries have returned to Achilles' grief as template, as standard against which other losses are measured. When writers want to convey annihilating sorrow, they reference Achilles mourning Patroclus. When artists depict anguish, they show Achilles over his friend's body. The myth has become vocabulary for describing what language struggles to capture directly. This is perhaps the highest form of immortality. Not that people remember your name, but that your experience becomes the language through which others understand their own experiences. Achilles lives on not just in retellings of his story, but in how his story helps others tell theirs. The armor, the shield, the spear, the ships, all these physical objects from his legend have symbolic weight beyond their literal function. They represent divine favor, mortal excellence, the tools through which glory is achieved and death is delivered. They become relics in the story, objects of power that carry meaning beyond their material existence. In our modern world, we still create such objects, awards, trophies, monuments, tokens that embody achievement and memory. We understand instinctively that physical things can hold emotional significance disproportionate to their actual utility. Achilles' shield, described in such elaborate detail in the Iliad, functions this way. It is both actual armor and symbolic cosmos, both protection and poetry, both thing and meaning. The catalogue of ships near the Iliad's beginning lists all the Greek forces, where they came from, who led them, how many ships each contributed. It is potentially tedious material, just names and numbers, yet it serves crucial purpose. It shows the scale of commitment to this war, the vast machinery of human effort bent toward one goal. the collectivity against which individual heroes stand out. Achilles brought 50 ships from Thea, not the most. Agamemnon brought more, but enough to make his withdrawal from fighting meaningful. 50 ships worth of warriors sitting idle while their companions died, all because of one man's wounded pride. The scale emphasizes both Achilles' importance and his selfishness, both his justified anger and its terrible cost. Numbers matter in epic. The 10 years of war, the 1,000 ships launched for Helen, the countless dead whose names are lost, the single heel that doomed the greatest warrior. The 2 paths offered by prophecy, the 3 goddesses fighting over a golden apple at his parents' wedding, the 12 days of desecrating Hector's corpse. These numbers become almost mystical, carrying weight beyond simple counting. 10 years is long enough to reshape lives. Boys become men, marriages fail, children grow up without parents, hope erodes into weariness. 1,000 ships is enough to darken the sea, to make the war feel cosmically significant rather than merely personal. 2 paths is the minimum necessary for genuine choice. And one heel, one vulnerable spot, one moment when the arrow flies true, one is enough to end everything. The cyclical nature of violence appears throughout Achilles' story. Agamemnon insults Achilles, who withdraws, which leads to Greek losses, which leads to Patroclus' death, which leads to Hector's death, which leads to Priam's grief, which leads to resumed fighting. Each action generates reaction. Each death requires vengeance. Each resolution proves temporary. This pattern is not unique to mythology. We see it in feuds that span generations, in cycles of retaliatory violence that outlive memory of initial causes, in wars that continue long past any reasonable calculation of benefit. The Trojan War lasted 10 years, not because it took that long to determine winner and loser, but because victory required not just defeating enemies, but destroying them completely, and destruction takes time. Achilles accelerated that process, but also exemplified its futility. He killed more Trojans than anyone, hastened Troy's fall, yet he himself died before seeing victory. He won every battle, and lost the war in the sense that mattered most to him. He did not survive to enjoy the glory he had earned. Unless, and this is the question that defines interpretation of his story, unless that was acceptable to him. Unless glory after death felt like victory, even if he could not experience it directly. Unless the point was never personal satisfaction, but rather making an impact that would outlive personal experience. In which case he succeeded perfectly, and his ghost's expressed regret in the underworld represents either Homer's commentary or simply the inevitable sorrow of the dead for the life they have lost, regardless of whether they spent it well. The ancient Greek afterlife, as Homer describes it, was profoundly unappealing. The dead became shades in the underworld, pale shadows of their living selves, drifting through grey landscapes without purpose or pleasure. Only through rituals performed by living descendants, through offerings and remembrance, could they maintain any vitality, and even then the existence was diminished, a pale echo of breathing life. This makes Achilles' choice even more stark. He knew that death meant becoming a shade, that the glorious name would persist while his actual consciousness would fade into that grey nothing. Yet he chose it anyway, valuing reputation over experience, choosing to be remembered rather than to continue living. Or perhaps the Greeks who created these stories understood something profound, that consciousness ends, that personal experience is temporary, but that impact on others, on culture, on the flow of history, that can genuinely continue. In choosing Kleos, Achilles was choosing the only form of immortality actually available to mortals. We do the same now, though we rarely frame it so dramatically. We have children to carry something of ourselves forward. We create art, write books, build businesses, make discoveries, hoping to leave marks on the world that outlast our flesh. We seek meaning through legacy because pure experience, however rich, dissolves with death. Achilles simply made that trade more explicit, more absolute, more conscious than most people do. He did not pretend he was choosing both long life and lasting impact. He understood the bargain clearly and accepted its terms. The Myrmidons, Achilles' warriors, deserve mention as extensions of his will and violence. They were legendary themselves, supposedly descended from ants that Zeus had transformed into humans as a favour to Achilles' grandfather. Whether this origin story was meant literally or metaphorically, suggesting they worked with ant-like discipline and coordination, they were formidable fighters who followed Achilles without question. When he withdrew from battle, they withdrew with him. When he returned in rage after Patroclus' death, they became instruments of his vengeance. Their loyalty to him was absolute, their effectiveness in combat extraordinary, their identity so bound up with his that they barely exist as individuals in the surviving accounts. This raises questions about leadership, about the warriors who follow charismatic commanders into violence, about the ethics of absolute loyalty. The Myrmidons made Achilles more dangerous, enabled his killing on mass scale, participated in his desecration of Hector's corpse. Were they complicit in his excesses, or were they simply following their culture's expectations of warrior behaviour? Ancient Greeks would likely not have framed the question that way. Loyalty to one's leader was virtue, not vice. Effectiveness in battle was excellence, not atrocity. The Myrmidons were admirable precisely because they followed Achilles completely, making themselves extensions of his will. But modern ethics struggle with that formulation, seeing in it the seeds of war crimes committed by soldiers just following orders, the abdication of individual moral responsibility to collective identity. The Myrmidons become troubling rather than admirable, their perfect loyalty a warning rather than an ideal. Yet again, Achilles and everything connected to him becomes lens through which we examine our own values, finding in ancient stories reflections of contemporary concerns. The relationship between Achilles and Agamemnon crystallizes conflicts that recur throughout human social organization. Agamemnon had political authority. He was high king, commander-in-chief, the leader whose word should be law. But Achilles had functional authority. He was the fighter who actually won battles, whose presence determined victory or defeat, whose skills justified his pride. When these two forms of power conflicted, chaos resulted. The army suffered while its greatest weapon sat idle. Men died because the leadership could not resolve a dispute about property and honor. The mission conquering Troy became secondary to personal conflicts between leaders. We see this pattern repeat in corporations, in governments, in any organization where formal hierarchy does not align with actual competence. The tension between positional authority and earned authority creates dysfunction that hurts everyone involved. Achilles and Agamemnon turned that tension into tragedy, but the underlying dynamic is depressingly common. Their eventual semi-reconciliation, Agamemnon offering gifts and apology after Patroclus' death prompted Achilles' return, resolved nothing fundamental. Achilles came back not because he forgave Agamemnon, but because his personal grief required violent expression. The relationship remained broken, only the circumstances changed. This feels authentic. Most conflicts do not resolve cleanly with mutual understanding and restored harmony. Instead, circumstances shift, making continued conflict impractical or irrelevant. People move forward not because wounds have healed, but because new priorities supersede old grievances. Achilles moved forward because Patroclus mattered infinitely more than Agamemnon's insult. The original injury remained unaddressed, unforgiven, simply rendered less important by overwhelming new emotion. That is not reconciliation, it is recalculation of what matters most. The funeral games held for Patroclus showcased ancient Greek culture's relationship with death and competition. When someone important died, they held athletic contests, chariot races, wrestling, archery, running. celebrating life through displays of excellence, honoring the dead by demonstrating the qualities the dead had valued. Achilles organized and presided over Patroclus's funeral games, giving prizes to the victors, mediating disputes between competitors. It was one of his few moments of appearing functional, capable of leadership and judgment beyond simply killing people. The games showed him at his best, generous, fair, invested in community cohesion rather than personal glory alone. They also provided catharsis, a communal outlet for grief that channeled it into structured competition rather than chaos. This is wise psychology dressed in cultural practice, giving people something to do with overwhelming emotion, creating rituals that acknowledge loss while reasserting life's continuation. Modern funerals serve similar purposes, though we rarely include athletic competition. We create structure around death wakes, services, burials, receptions, giving mourners actions to perform, giving grief shape and communal expression. The particulars differ across cultures, but the underlying need remains constant. The gods' interference in the Trojan War escalated as the conflict continued. Initially, they maintained some pretense of neutrality, but by the war's end, they were fighting each other on the battlefield, physically joining combat on behalf of their favored sides. Ares supported the Trojans until Athena helped Diomedes wound him. Aphrodite tried to rescue her son Aeneas and got wounded for her trouble. Apollo protected Trojans while Poseidon supported Greeks. This divine involvement makes the war simultaneously cosmic and absurd. On one hand, the gods' participation elevated the conflict to mythological significance. This was not merely human nations fighting, but the universe itself taking sides. On the other hand, gods bickering and fighting over mortal concerns reduced them to oversized children, powerful but petty, intervening capriciously rather than justly. Achilles moved through this divine chaos as semi-divine himself, protected by some gods, opposed by others, ultimately subject to their whims despite his excellence. His semi-divine status made him greater than ordinary mortals but did not elevate him to divine immunity. He remained killable, and the gods ensured he was killed when prophecy required it. This occupying of middle ground, more than human but less than divine, defines his tragedy. He had enough power to devastate armies but not enough to escape destiny. He had goddess mother's protection but inherited his father's mortality. He lived in both worlds fully while belonging completely to neither. Many people occupy similar middle grounds in less dramatic ways. Too educated for their birth community but not credentialed enough for academic elite, too successful to relate to former peers but not wealthy enough for upper class, too something for one category but not enough for another. The between space where Achilles lived is psychologically recognizable even when the specific circumstances are mythological. His anger at being caught between worlds, having divine heritage but mortal limitations, manifested as rage at mortals who disrespected him. Agamemnon, treating him as just another subordinate warrior, denied the reality of his semi-divine nature. The insult was not merely personal but existential, questioning his fundamental identity. When someone's basic sense of self is challenged, reactions often seem disproportionate to outside observers. Achilles withdrawing from battle over being denied a war prize looks petty until you understand he was fighting for recognition of his exceptional nature, defending his identity against reduction to commonness. We all do this to some degree, overreact to perceived slights that touch our self-concept, defend ourselves disproportionately when core identity feels threatened. Achilles just did it with mythological stakes and body counts. The prophecies surrounding Achilles were unusually specific and known to multiple parties. He knew he could choose long life or glory. Thetis knew both options. Calchas prophesied Troy would not fall without him. Everyone operated with unusual clarity about destiny's shape, even if exact details remained uncertain. This created strange dynamics. Achilles chose knowing the cost. Thetis tried to prevent what she knew was coming. The Greeks recruited him understanding he was necessary. The Trojans faced him knowing he was doom incarnate. Prophecy removed some surprise while adding different tension. Not what will happen, but how will the inevitable unfold. Most people live with much less clarity about their futures. We make choices based on incomplete information, respond to surprises we could not anticipate, live in genuine uncertainty about outcomes. Achilles' certainty about the basic shape of his fate, short, glorious or long obscure, is unusual in human experience. Yet perhaps it is less unusual than it seems. Most people know, on some level, that comfortable, safe choices lead to comfortable, safe lives, while risky, ambitious choices lead to dramatic outcomes, good or bad. The specific prophecy Achilles received just made explicit what is implicitly true for everyone: you can play it safe or bet on excellence, and each path has predictable costs and benefits. His choice to sail for Troy was choosing discomfort, danger, excellence, impact, choosing to matter at cost of safety. Millions make similar choices in less dramatic contexts every day, pursuing careers or relationships or causes that demand everything while offering uncertain reward. The question of whether Achilles' choice was wise remains unresolved after millennia. Some view him as hero, exemplifying proper priorities, choosing meaning over mere existence, accepting mortality's terms, living with intensity rather than duration. Others see foolishness, throwing away decades of potential life and love for abstract glory, valuing posthumous fame over present happiness. Both interpretations have merit, which is precisely why the story endures. If the answer were obvious, there would be no need for continued examination. But Achilles' choice sits in that uncomfortable space where reasonable people disagree, where values clash, where no clear resolution exists. He haunts us because he forces us to choose what we believe matters. If you condemn his choice, you are implicitly arguing that life's value lies in its duration, in accumulation of experiences, in preservation of self. If you admire his choice, you are implicitly arguing that life's value lies in its intensity, in achievement of excellence, in impact on others. Neither position is obviously wrong, neither is obviously right. The tension between them defines much of how humans think about purpose and meaning. Have you ever faced a choice where both options were defensible but mutually exclusive, where choosing one meant forever wondering about the other? The relationship between Achilles and his divine armor creates interesting symbolism. The first set, forged by Hephaestus for his wedding to Thetis and inherited by Achilles, he lent to Patroclus, who died wearing it. That armor, stained with his beloved's blood, was taken by Hector as spoils of war. The second set, forged specifically for Achilles after Patroclus's death, he wore during his rampage against Troy, during the slaughter that avenged his friend and hastened his own doom. That armor witnessed his greatest victories and protected him up until the moment it did not, until Apollo guided an arrow to the one spot left vulnerable. Armor represents the gap between aspiration and reality, between protection desired and protection achieved. We all wear metaphorical armor, emotional defenses, professional competence, social masks, trying to protect our vulnerabilities while projecting strength. And we all have our heels, spots where the armor fails to reach, where we remain exposed despite our best efforts. Achilles' literal invulnerability in all places except one is just an exaggeration of universal human experience. We all have weak spots we try to hide, vulnerabilities we protect, places where we can be hurt despite general competence. His myth makes literal what is usually metaphorical. The fact that his armor could not protect his heel, could not cover the one vulnerability that mattered, speaks to the ultimate inadequacy of external defenses. You can forge the finest bronze, You can invoke divine protection, you can do everything right, and still you remain mortal. Still you can be destroyed. Still the universe will find your weak spot eventually. This is not pessimism, but realism. Acknowledging vulnerability is not weakness, but wisdom. Achilles' tragedy was not that he had a vulnerable heel, but that he forgot about it, that he acted as if invulnerability everywhere else meant invulnerability total. We make similar mistakes, performing competence so thoroughly that we forget our actual limitations, projecting strength so convincingly that we believe our own facade, protecting ourselves so completely in most areas that we forget the places left exposed. The arrow finds the heel eventually. The question is whether we remember our own mortality and vulnerability before that moment, whether we live with appropriate humility despite our armor, whether we acknowledge our heels while striving for excellence everywhere else. Achilles lived as if he were invulnerable until the instant he discovered he was not. That confidence enabled his achievements and ensured his death. Both outcomes traced to the same source: the certainty that he was more than merely mortal, the conviction that his divine heritage outweighed his human limitations. The beach where Achilles died, where countless warriors from both sides fell during 10 years of conflict, must have been saturated with blood and memory by the war's end. The sand had absorbed violence for a decade, seen heroes and common soldiers alike dying in surf that washed away nothing, preserved everything in story if not in substance. That beach became sacred ground, not through divine designation, but through accumulated suffering. Every place where humans have fought generation after generation carries similar weight layers of tragedy soaked into earth, memory encoded in landscape, the geography itself transformed by what happened there. Troy's actual location, when archaeologists found it, showed evidence of multiple destructions and rebuildings spanning centuries. The war Homer described might have been one specific conflict or an amalgamation of many. The beach where Achilles supposedly fell might have seen dozens of warriors resembling him in pride and prowess, their individual stories eventually merging into single mythological narrative. This does not make the myth less true, only differently true. Whether Achilles was one person or many, whether his death happened exactly as described or symbolically represents countless deaths, the story captures something real about violence, glory, choice, and consequences. Historical accuracy matters less than psychological authenticity. The myth of Achilles works because it articulates patterns we recognize. The brilliant young person who dies before fulfilling potential, the warrior whose excellence makes him arrogant, the son whose mother cannot save him, the friend whose death triggers cascade of violence, the choice between safety and significance. These patterns recur constantly in human experience. We have all known someone like Achilles in miniature, burning bright, headed toward destruction, impossible to save from themselves. We have all faced choices between comfort and meaning. We have all lost people we loved and felt the subsequent rage. We have all wondered if the risks we took were worth their costs. Achilles provides language for these experiences. His story gives shape to feelings that otherwise remain inchoate. When we say someone has an Achilles heel, or burns too bright to last, or chose death and glory over life and obscurity, we are invoking his myth to explain realities that feel timeless despite their particular circumstances. This is mythology's function, not to provide historical documentation, but to offer psychological truth, not to record what literally happened, but to capture what always happens, not to preserve facts, but to encode patterns. The weeping of Thetis, goddess mother who outlived her mortal son and would continue outliving him forever, represents perhaps the myth's deepest tragedy. She had power enough to reshape rivers, but not enough to change her son's nature. She had foresight enough to know his choices, but not authority to prevent them. She had love enough to drown worlds, but it could not save the one person she loved most. Divine impotence in the face of mortal free will is a profound concept. The gods could manipulate circumstances, offer gifts, intervene in battles, but they could not override human choice without destroying the humanity that made mortals meaningful to them. Thetis could not force Achilles to choose the long, safe life because that would eliminate the choice, and without choice there is no virtue in safety, no glory in excellence, no meaning in any decision. So she had to watch. She had to witness her son sailing toward death with full knowledge and zero ability to prevent it. She had to be omniscient and powerless simultaneously, grieving for a loss that was always coming, mourning before the death occurred because she could see its approach from divine distance. Every parent understands a shadow of this. You watch your children make choices you know will hurt them. You see consequences approaching that they cannot yet recognize. You want to prevent pain, but understand that preventing all pain means preventing growth. That some learning can only come through experience, that protecting them from everything means stunting them. Thetis could not even take comfort in the possibility that protecting Achilles from glory would help him grow. She knew, absolutely knew, that preventing him from choosing his path would leave him diminished, bitter, forever wondering about the life not lived. His glory was the right choice for him even though it destroyed her. That is love's cruelest lesson. Sometimes the right thing for someone you love is terrible for you. Sometimes supporting them means accepting outcomes that devastate you. Sometimes love requires enabling choices that ensure loss. Thetis enabled Achilles. She got him armor, supported his decisions, facilitated his path toward glory and death. She did not sabotage him despite knowing the cost. That is divinity operating at highest level power, restrained by love, foresight subordinated to respect for autonomy, immortal grief accepted as price of mortal freedom. When Achilles' shade complained in the underworld that he would rather be a living slave than a dead king, was that his true feeling or temporary despair? Did he genuinely regret his choice? Or was he simply expressing the universal lament of the dead for life itself, regardless of how that life was spent? We cannot know. The dead cannot clarify their statements, but the ambiguity matters. It prevents Achilles' story from becoming simple propaganda for either position. If he clearly celebrated his choice from the afterlife, the myth would become unambiguous endorsement of glory over safety. If he clearly regretted it, the myth would become cautionary tale against ambition. Instead, it remains unresolved, leaving each person to interpret according to their own values and experiences. That interpretive space is where myths do their deepest work, not telling you what to think, but forcing you to think, not providing answers, but insisting on questions. The final images of Achilles that persist through centuries are multiple and contradictory. Achilles raging in his tent, sulking over insult. Achilles charging into battle, armor blazing, unstoppable and terrifying. Achilles weeping over Patroclus's body, grief incarnate. Achilles showing mercy to Priam, humanity emerging through rage's cracks. Achilles falling to an arrow in the heel, brought down by the vulnerability his mother accidentally created. None of these images is complete alone. Together, they form mosaic of someone impossibly complex, hero and monster, victim and perpetrator, divine and mortal, glorious and grieving, wise and foolish, sympathetic and appalling. He contains these contradictions without resolving them because humans contain such contradictions. We are all multiple selves, different versions activated by different circumstances. We are all capable of greatness and pettiness, love and violence, wisdom and folly. Achilles just lived those contradictions at mythological scale, making them visible, giving them narrative form. His immortality lies not in avoiding death. He died young, but in the enduring relevance of his story. 28 centuries after Homer composed the Iliad, we still tell the tale. New generations discover Achilles and find in him reflections of their own struggles with choice, identity, mortality, love, loss, and meaning. The bronze armor has corroded to dust. The ships that carried him to Troy rotted away millennia ago. The beach where he died has been reshaped by time and tide. The very language in which his story was first told is dead, spoken now only by scholars. But Achilles himself, the idea of Achilles, the pattern of Achilles, the challenge of Achilles remains alive, vital, pressing. He still asks us, what matters more, duration or intensity? What price is glory worth? How should humans face inevitable death? When is rage justified? What does loyalty demand? How do we live with choices that cannot be unmade? These questions do not age. They renew themselves with each generation, each person confronting them fresh. And Achilles stands ready, eternal in his 20 years, forever young and fierce and doomed and glorious, offering not answers but his own example. Flawed, brilliant, tragic, inspiring, a mirror in which each generation sees itself differently, a test by which we measure our own values and priorities. The teachers who came after Chiron, those who learned from Achilles' example rather than instructing him directly, found in his story pedagogical goldmine. Warriors studied his tactics, his economy of movement, his ability to read opponents and exploit weaknesses. Poets examined his rage and grief as templates for expressing extreme emotion. Philosophers debated whether his choice demonstrated wisdom or folly, whether glory earned through violence could be truly glorious, whether fame achieved through causing suffering deserved celebration or condemnation. Each discipline extracted different lessons. Military strategists saw in Achilles the importance of individual excellence within collective effort, the way one exceptional warrior could shift entire conflicts. They also saw the danger of individualism unchecked, how Achilles' withdrawal endangered the very army he was meant to protect, how personal grievance could supersede strategic necessity. Ethicists examined his treatment of enemies, particularly the escalating brutality after Patroclus died. Was his desecration of Hector's corpse understandable grief response or inexcusable violation of warrior codes? Was his eventual mercy to Priam redemption, or merely momentary weakness in otherwise unforgivable behavior? Could someone be hero and war criminal simultaneously? And if so, what did that reveal about how we construct narratives around violence? Psychologists, once that discipline emerged, found in Achilles rich material for studying trauma, grief, rage, and the ways extreme emotions reshape personality. His transformation after Patroclus's death, from angry but controlled to absolutely murderous, illustrated how loss can fundamentally alter someone's relationship to violence and restraint. The concept of the berserker, the warrior who enters trance-like state of enhanced combat ability disconnected from normal human emotion, appears across multiple cultures. Achilles embodies this archetype perfectly. His Aristeia, his superhuman combat sequences, read like someone operating beyond ordinary consciousness, channeling something primal and terrifying. Whether this represents actual psychological state achievable through extreme emotion or is purely literary device matters less than its persistence across cultures and centuries. The idea that grief or rage can unlock capacities beyond normal human function resonates deeply, suggesting universal recognition that extreme states produce extreme abilities, though at terrible cost. Modern psychology might diagnose Achilles with various conditions: PTSD from years of combat, complicated grief after Patroclus's death, perhaps narcissistic personality disorder given his pride and need for recognition. These labels would likely miss something essential about him, reducing mythological complexity to clinical categories. But they would also illuminate aspects of his psychology that ancient audiences might have taken for granted, the way trauma compounds through repeated exposure to violence, the way grief can manifest as rage when direct expression of sorrow feels too vulnerable, the way someone raised to believe they are exceptional might struggle with normal social hierarchies and compromises. Achilles was, in many ways, broken long before Patroclus died. Years of being told he was semi-divine, years of training for excellence, years of prophecy hanging over him, these would damage anyone's ability to function as a normal person. His withdrawal over Briseis was not just about the specific insult, but about a lifetime of being exceptional, finally colliding with the reality of political hierarchy. The wonder is not that he struggled with normal social interaction, but that he managed it at all, that he could show mercy to Priam, that he could love Briseis and Patroclus, that he could organize funeral games and mediate disputes, that humanity persisted through divine heritage and warrior training and prophetic doom. The communities that claimed descent from Achilles in the centuries after Troy, various Greek cities asserting connection to him through bloodline or geography or simply aspirational identification, were making statements about their values and identity. To claim Achilles as ancestor was to claim excellence, martial prowess, and glory as defining characteristics. It was also, whether they acknowledged it or not, to claim pride, rage, and tragedy as inheritance. These cities held festivals honoring him, athletic competitions in his name, rituals maintaining connection to his memory. They told stories of his appearances, ghost sightings, visions, moments when his shade supposedly intervened in battles or blessed heroes. They made him into protective deity, transforming dead warrior into immortal guardian. This process of hero worship, of elevating exceptional humans to quasi-divine status after death, reveals something about how cultures process loss and create continuity. The dead cannot leave entirely if we keep them present through ritual and story. Achilles could not die completely as long as people kept invoking him, kept telling his story, kept measuring themselves against his example. But this immortality through memory is a strange form of existence. The real Achilles, if he existed, was mortal with all mortality's complications. Bad days and digestive problems and moments of cowardice and petty thoughts and all the mundane reality that gets edited out of legend. The immortal Achilles is cleaned up, perfected, made consistent in ways real people never are. Which version is more real? The flawed human who actually lived, or the perfected legend that continues living through retelling? If more people know the legend than ever knew the man, if the legend has influenced more lives and shaped more decisions, does the legend become more real than the reality it supposedly represents? These are not idle questions. We all perform versions of ourselves for others, all curate our public identities, all become characters in stories others tell about us. The gap between who we actually are and who we are perceived to be defines much of social existence. Achilles just experienced this gap at extreme scale, the distance between man and myth growing with each generation of retelling. His mother knew him truly, knew the boy who learned medicine from Chiron, who played music, who felt uncertain and frightened alongside confident and fierce. His enemies knew him as unstoppable killing machine, nightmare given form. His companions knew him as both capable of friendship, but also of rage that terrified even allies. Each perspective captured truth without capturing totality. The Iliad itself, our primary source for Achilles, covers only a few weeks of the war's 10th year. It shows us Achilles in crisis, insulted, withdrawn, grieving, raging, but not Achilles in the 9 previous years of fighting. Not Achilles as child, not Achilles in peaceful moments. Homer gave us snapshot, extraordinarily detailed but still limited, from which we extrapolate entire person. Imagine if your life were known only through its worst few weeks, your identity constructed from your behavior during extreme crisis. Would that version of you represent you accurately? Would strangers understanding you through that lens alone grasp who you actually are? This is what happened to Achilles. His crisis became his entirety in cultural memory, his rage and grief overshadowing whatever gentler qualities he possessed. Yet perhaps that is fitting. Perhaps the crisis revealed his essence in ways that peace never could. Perhaps extreme circumstances strip away social performance and reveal core nature. Perhaps Achilles, in rage and grief, was most authentically himself, all pretense burned away by intensity of emotion. Or perhaps not. Perhaps we are most ourselves in quiet moments of connection, in choices made when no one is watching, in sustained patterns of behavior rather than dramatic peaks. Perhaps Achilles' essence lay not in his rampage after Patroclus died, but in his 9 years of fighting competently without particular drama, in his capacity for love despite being trained primarily for violence, in his moment of mercy with Priam. The interpretive space remains open. Each reader brings own understanding of human nature to the story and sees Achilles accordingly. This is myth functioning properly, not dictating meaning but inviting interpretation, not resolving questions but insisting they be asked. The physicality of Achilles deserves attention. Ancient descriptions emphasize his beauty, golden hair, powerful build, grace in movement that made violence look like dance. Beauty and deadliness combined, attractiveness and terror merged. He was supposed to be so physically perfect that seeing him was dangerous. People fell in love, fell into awe, fell into fear just from witnessing his appearance. This tells us something about Greek ideals, that physical perfection and martial excellence were seen as naturally connected, that beauty and violence were not opposites but complements, that the body could express multiple forms of excellence simultaneously. The warrior athlete artist as ideal combined aesthetics with function, appearance with capability. Modern sensibilities often separate these domains. We talk about inner beauty versus outer beauty, physical versus moral qualities, as if they occupy different spheres. But Greek culture, at least as reflected in their myths, saw integration. The hero was beautiful because he was excellent, or excellent because he was beautiful, or both beauty and excellence flowed from same divine source. Achilles embodied this integration. His beauty made his violence more terrible. Something so aesthetically perfect should not be capable of such destruction, yet was. His excellence made his beauty meaningful appearance backed by genuine capability rather than hollow facade. But beauty and excellence could not save him from mortality. This is perhaps the point, that even perfection is temporary, even glory fades, even the most beautiful and capable eventually fall. The heel remains vulnerable regardless of how flawless the rest appears. The artists who depicted Achilles across centuries each emphasized different aspects. Ancient Greek pottery showed him in battle, mid-thrust with spear, geometric and stylized. Roman mosaics portrayed him more naturalistically, often in dramatic moments like dragging Hector's body. Medieval manuscripts dressed him in contemporary armor, made him look like a crusader knight. Renaissance paintings emphasized his classical beauty, positioning him in idealized landscapes. Modern interpretations range from hypermasculine action hero to thoughtful young man caught in circumstances beyond his control. Each artistic choice reflects not just technical skill but cultural values. What aspects of Achilles does each era choose to emphasize? What gets included, excluded, transformed? These choices tell us about the artists and their audiences as much as about Achilles himself. A medieval manuscript showing Achilles in Christian prayer before battle reveals more about medieval Christianity than about Bronze Age paganism. A film depicting him as reluctant warrior dragged into conflict by politics tells us about modern skepticism toward military adventure. An ancient Greek vase showing him perfectly proportioned and victorious expresses that culture's celebration of martial excellence. Achilles thus becomes archaeological site where layers of interpretation accumulate, each era leaving its mark, none definitive, all revealing. Digging through these layers exposes changing values, shifting aesthetics, evolving understanding of heroism and tragedy. The silence of Achilles interests some scholars more than his speeches. Homer gives him extraordinary lines, his rage declaration opening the Iliad, his grief over Patroclus, his conversation with Priam. But much of his time is spent not speaking, just acting, just being present as force rather than voice. This creates interpretive challenge. How do we understand someone whose interiority is rarely directly expressed? We infer from actions, from what others say about him, from the structure of narrative itself, but inference is uncertain, projection inevitable. Modern retellings often give Achilles more interiority, more self-reflection, more articulated motivation. We are uncomfortable with opacity, prefer characters whose thoughts are accessible. But perhaps the original opacity was intentional. Perhaps Achilles was meant to be partially unknowable, force of nature as much as person, embodiment of principles rather than fully realized psychology. Or perhaps ancient audiences simply assumed they understood him without need for explanation. Perhaps his motivation seemed obvious to people raised in honor culture, where glory justified risk, where shame was worse than death, where a warrior's reputation mattered more than his comfort. We cannot think ourselves into Bronze Age psychology completely. We can study the culture, read the texts, make informed guesses. But some distance remains uncrossable. Achilles speaks to us across millennia, but the language has changed, the context has shifted, the assumptions have evolved. We hear him through translation, through cultural transformation, through our own inevitable projections. Yet something communicates anyway. Something in his story reaches across all that distance and resonates. Perhaps it is the simplicity beneath complexity, young person facing death, making choices about how to spend limited time, loving and losing, achieving and suffering. These patterns recur regardless of cultural specifics. Or perhaps it is the questions he raises that prove universal questions about meaning and mortality, excellence and cost, love and violence, choice and fate. These questions do not age because human condition does not fundamentally change. We have better medicine, more technology, different social structures, but we still die, still choose, still love, still suffer, still wonder if our lives matter. Achilles provides no answers. He provides example, flawed, complicated, simultaneously inspiring and cautionary. He shows us someone who chose maximally, who committed completely, who burned absolutely bright. Whether that choice was wise remains forever debatable, which keeps the conversation alive. His story ends with death, but not with conclusion. The narrative stops, but meaning continues multiplying. Each generation discovers him fresh, interprets him newly, finds in his ancient choices reflection of contemporary dilemmas. This is how myths remain vital, not by providing fixed meaning, but by offering productive ambiguity, not by resolving, but by resonating. So Achilles runs forever across that beach toward Troy, forever young, forever fierce, forever choosing glory over safety, forever dying with vulnerable heel exposed, forever haunting us with questions about what matters, what endures, what makes brief human life meaningful in the face of inevitable death and eventual forgetting. Except we have not forgotten. That is the final irony, the ultimate vindication of his choice. He chose kleos over life, fame over longevity, glory over comfort. And here we are, 28 centuries later, still speaking his name, still telling his story, still measuring our own choices against his example. He won. By the terms he valued, he succeeded completely. His name has indeed proved imperishable, his glory enduring, his life meaningful beyond any measure of years. Whether that victory tastes sweet or bitter to his shade in the underworld, we cannot know. But for us, still living, still choosing, still facing our own mortality and wondering how to spend our limited time for us, Achilles remains endlessly relevant, endlessly challenging, endlessly alive in the only immortality mortals can actually achieve, story told and retold, meaning discovered and rediscovered, questions asked and asked again by each new generation encountering this most ancient, most immediate, most human of heroes. And so, dreamers, we reach the end of Achilles' journey, a story of choice and consequence, of love and loss, of glory earned and life surrendered. We've walked with him from Chiron's mountain caves to Troy's blood-soaked beaches, witnessed his rage and grief, his violence and mercy, his brief burning brightness that still illuminates the darkness 28 centuries later. His questions remain yours to answer in your own lives, in your own ways. What matters most? Duration or intensity? Safety or significance? The comfortable long road or the brilliant short one? There are no wrong answers, only choices, only consequences, only the life you build from the time you're given. As you drift towards sleep, perhaps you'll dream of that ancient beach, of warriors and gods, of a young man who chose to matter more than to last, and proved that stories can carry us beyond death into something like forever. Rest well, dreamers. Let Achilles' tale settle into your thoughts like silt after storm. Tomorrow brings its own choices, its own chances to burn bright or last long, its own opportunities to decide what legacy you'll leave in the hearts of those who'll remember you. Good night.